Thank you, Ms. Isadora. That was a very reflective presentation as well, and I'm sure everyone agrees that from the presentation itself, it's just a very detailed overview of the relationship that language has played in your professional career, and also in promoting and integrating language into social and intergenerational dynamics cohesively. Our last presenter today is an arts and cultural professional whose array of roles and experiences in the language has seen in the field has also seen language very integral and integrated in his work. Shrida Mani is the company manager and co-artistic director of the Opera People, a Singapore-based arts company redefining live and online experiences of opera through multidisciplinary collaboration. He is also the co-founder of the Public Space and a local arts initiative, Other Tongues, a festival of minority voices. He has also held roles in the Esplanade Theatres of the Bay, the Arts House Limited, and National Gallery Singapore across music, dance, theatre, and literary arts. Shrida has also lent his expertise into festivals like the Kala Utsavam Indian Festival of Arts, Dance Festival, a tapestry of sacred music at the Esplanade, Singapore Art International Festival of the Arts, and Lumination at the Arts House. He will be talking about multilingualism, vernacularism, and intimacy, which brings us through his personal contexts that have cultivated his learnings in ancestral and new languages. And I'd like to invite Shrida to the stage, please.
Morning, everyone, and thank you, Shireen, for the intro. Thank you. I'm speaking a little bit about my own identity and also sort of my relationship with language. I always wished I was a polyglot. I always wished I spoke 20 languages. I have a friend. The most polyglot person I know is a friend of mine from when I lived in Tokyo, and he is half Iranian and half Greek, and he speaks a total of 9 languages fluently. He's the most. That's the most I know. I wish I could even get to that level, but I cannot. I currently speak one language completely fluently, of course, and 2 languages with a decent level of fluency. One with competency, but I'll get to that. But sort of what I wanted to talk about was sort of multilingualism and especially vernacularism, which ties very much to my family. I think because we've lost a lot of that here in Singapore with sort of the kind of forced pathways down certain languages, I think it made us lose sort of connections to our own dialects and own home dialects especially, and how that connects with sort of a certain intimacy with our identity as well. So I'll begin with this quote by Arundhati Roy, who's one of my favorite writers. And in this essay, "In What Language Does Rain Fall Over Tormented Cities?" she says, "Language is that most private and yet most public of things," which I think in the Singapore context is particularly important because we have 4 official languages, but traditionally have spoken many more languages than that in our homes. And even amongst, I'll get to the Indian community separately, but even amongst obviously the Chinese and the Malay communities, that many people actually spoke regional languages at homes prior to the integration of the national languages into the education system. And a lot of my my grandparents obviously like grew up in a time in which the common sort of market language was Malay, but everybody spoke very different languages at home as well. So it's in some way our own relationship to language is defined very much by sort of sacrificing the private for the sake of the public. And we've also made that decision with sort of English being the business language as well, in that we've sort of over time lost certain connections to our own languages or our ancestral languages. This is just an overview, and it's kind of what I wrote in my write up, which is that multilingualism is very much a part of being Singaporean, but and I was very lucky to grow up in a very multilingual household, but that because there's an homogeneity that we desire here as well, that it put me at odds with sort of the intimacy to my own languages, as opposed to sort of like the languages I had to learn or communicate with in a public setting. Okay, I'll begin by talking about where my family is from. So the the southwest corner of that map is a state in India called Kerala. Has anybody here been to Kerala? No? Okay, Kerala is the smallest state of all the Indian states. It occupies the southwest corner. So if you see where it says Palakkad there, and then all the way down to Thiruvananthapuram, that's kind of the width of it. It's a very thin state. It's the smallest state in India, but also traditionally the most cosmopolitan because it was always at the center of a lot of shipping routes over a long period of time. Not just shipping routes, but also religiously, it was a big center. In the first century BC, Saint Thomas Aquinas, who was one of the 12 apostles, according to legend, came to Kerala, and he actually established a Christian community there that in Kerala is known as the Syrian Christian community because Saint Thomas was Syrian, but is sort of more formally known as the Orthodox Church of Saint Thomas. And the Church of Saint Thomas actually incorporates Hindu practices into their worship services. So they light lamps at the start of every service. All Syrian Christians have a Hindu and apostolic name. So they will have a name like, Raj Michael, something like that. So in the 14th century, when the Portuguese came to Kerala, the Catholic Portuguese came essentially looking to set up trade routes in the spice trade, but also to convert people. They didn't know that there was an existing Christian community already there. And the other thing is, like, funnily enough, so at home in Kerala, we actually use a wok, and the Malayalam name for a wok is a chin chatti, which literally means a Chinese pot, because when the Chinese came to Kerala for the spice trade, they brought woks with them. And if you go to Cochin on the beach, you'll see these famous, they're called Chinese fishing nets because the Chinese brought the fishing nets to Kerala. So it has always been sort of very much even though it's sort of a very small state and it's very far away from the political realm of India today, which is very much centered in Delhi, it has always been at the very heart of Indian cosmopolitanism. The community I come from are a group called Palakkad Brahmins. So my family belongs to the Brahmin caste, but so Palakkad is that region right there. It's marked in the map. And the history of how we came to this region is very unknown, but what we do know is that sometime between the 1300s and the 1400s, because of wars happening in Tamil Nadu between various kingdoms, in the kingdom of Madurai, which you can see on the map, which was run by the Chola kings, the Pandyan kings, in order to drive out their rivals, they allied with the Mughals in the north. So the Mughal armies who were based in sort of the Delhi region came down south to help the Pandyan kings drive out their sort of rivals. But in that process, many people were displaced from Madurai west. And my sort of ancestors moved west into Kerala and established a community there because the Chera kingdom gave them land in this region. So what does all this mean? What it means is that we traditionally are Tamilians who came from Kerala and therefore spoke at home a dialect that mixed sort of Tamil, that mixed Tamil from Madurai and Malayalam from Kerala. So the dialect that we speak, and Tamilians will know this, is called Palakkad Tamil, and it is only about 70% intelligible with what would be considered standard Tamil. But growing up at home, I only spoke as a child. I only spoke this dialect. I had no understanding really of what sort of standard formal Tamil was. I put some words here and I'll kind of like run through them. So the English word for English is water. The standard Tamil word for water is tannir, and the Palakkad Tamil word for it is vellam. Vellam in standard Tamil means flood. Yeah. In English, the English word for pumpkin in Tamil is pusanikai, and in Palakkad Tamil it's mutton. And again, Tamil has distinctions between a T that is pronounced at the tip of the tongue and a T that's pronounced at the end. So mutton is different from mutton. Mutton is meat, but if you are just speaking sort of very fast, you can mix the words up. So I still remember when I was a kid and we had a helper from Tamil Nadu, my mom kept telling her to cook the mutton, and she was like confused because she's like, "Aren't these people vegetarians? Like, why are they asking me to make mutton?" Um, and then the last word, memory, in Tamil is nyabagam, and in Palakkad we say orme, but in orme in standard Tamil means sameness or oneness. Yeah. So the words actually have different meanings, and in some cases actually have words in Tamil that mean something completely different from what we say in the dialect. So I always grew up with this slight confusion over sort of what, and ultimately, I mean, who decides what is correct and what is not correct, right? But this language has been so crucial to my identity because it has always connected me to sort of my ancestors who came from this place in Kerala, which I have never even been to myself. I'll kind of then I'm moving on to sort of talking about my own journey and sort of how like my grandparents coming from Kerala also sort of shaped the way language sort of influenced my how language has had an influence on myself. On the right are my paternal grandparents. My grandfather came from Cochin, which is sort of the largest city in the capital of Kerala. He, but prior to that, he had worked in a number of cities in India before coming to Singapore right after the war. My paternal grandmother is from a small town in the north of Kerala called Guruvayur, which is very famous for that temple over there, the temple of Lord Vishnu. And she came here in 1931, just and lived through the war here in Singapore. My maternal grandparents, my grandfather comes from a small town also in northern Kerala called Chertala, which literally means mud, head in the mud. And it's because there's a temple there, and it's believed that the temple was built because a saint happened to encounter the goddess there as a little girl in the form of a little girl, and he chased her trying to sort of get her blessings, but because she was a child, she sort of ran around, and in order to catch her, he pushed her into the mud. And so if you go to the temple there, the sanctum is actually way below eye level to sort of replicate the goddess being trapped in the mud. My grandmother is from Chennai, or Madras, as it was known then. Madras is a very interesting city in India because it was one of the few places in British India that was a crown colony like Singapore, meaning that it was under direct British rule and not run by a local administrative government. Yep. So my grand, my so everyone came from different parts of this region, and between them they spoke quite a number of languages. So I've kind of mapped this out. So, and there was supposed to be a label that is missing. Never mind. So my paternal grandfather spoke English, Malayalam, which he learned in school, Tamil, Palakkad Tamil that he learned at home, Hindi, which in Kerala you were required to learn in school, Marathi because he worked in Pune in Maharashtra for a long time, and Malay because he lived in Singapore. My paternal grandmother spoke English, Malayalam, Tamil, and Malay, also because she went to CHIJ and learned Malay there. My maternal grandfather spoke English, Malayalam, Tamil, Hindi, and Malay, and my maternal grandmother spoke Tamil, Malay, and English. So I grew up in a household where sort of on average everyone spoke about four different languages, and that they were constantly interchanging between them because they were always interacting with different people. Especially my maternal grandparents lived in Malaysia, so they were always having to switch. So at home they would speak Tamil, but my grandfather would only speak to his siblings in Malayalam. He would speak to anybody that he encountered on a day-to-day basis in Malay, and we also code switch between Tamil and English. But he would also practice his Hindi with people who could speak Hindi. So he was always like shifting languages. Yep. And then these are my parents. My mother was born in a small town in Malaysia called Tanjung Malim, which is on the Selangor Perak border. She spoke English. She speaks English, Malayalam, Tamil, and Malay, but only reads and writes English and Malay. My father was born here in Singapore in 1957, and he speaks English, Tamil, and Malay, but again, Tamil in our dialect, and only reads and writes English and Malay. So the thing is that my parents grew up with a very strong Malay language education because of the time that they lived in. My mother actually did her university education in Malaysia, and she was actually the first batch that in which the university syllabus was converted to Malay during sort of Prime Minister Mahathir's first few terms in office. So she said that it was challenging for her because all of the textbooks were still in English, but all of the exams had to be administered and written in Malay. So she said that her entire university education was spent code switching written English into written Malay because none of the textbooks had been produced in Malay yet. In fact, when I was a kid, my parents would speak to each other in Malay when they didn't want my brother and I listening into their conversation. But eventually we sort of picked up what they would say lah. But it provided the interesting thing that happened was when we got to school. That's me, aged 4 or 5, I think. So I learned English at home, and I spoke the Tamil that my grandparents spoke to me, which was this dialect of Tamil. When I was going to go to primary 1, my parents preferred for me to learn Malay in school, but as an Indian, I was not allowed to actually learn Malay. I had to learn Tamil, a language that we only spoke a dialect of, and that none of my parents read or wrote. So it was very challenging for them because they had no way of instructing me personally in a language that is our mother tongue because we didn't speak that Tamil that is taught in schools. So they were thankfully they were smart, and they actually sent me to learn the primary 1 syllabus when I was 6, so that I would always be ahead of the sort of those who spoke standard Tamil at home. But when I went to school, I was constantly using words from our dialect in school because those were the only words I knew for those things, and I had to essentially relearn a new way of thinking about a language that technically I already knew. And this is what sort of dialect or vernacular sort of way of thinking is that we all speak a certain language with a certain intimacy that is connected to our family, that is connected to our heritage and our ancestors. But then in a public space, we are essentially forced to switch how that language functions in order to sort of fit into what a collective has deemed to be the way a particular language has to function. I also had the privilege of growing up overseas. My father was transferred for work or a lot. So in international schools, I learned French as a second language, and also learned Italian and German in university. I also lived in Japan, so I have a very fundamental knowledge of Japanese, but not very good. Yeah. So I was this is sort of like this cosmopolitan linguistic sort of environment that I grew up in, and I was always exposed to languages constantly and people switching languages constantly, and because of that, my brain became quite wired to picking up language with a lot of efficiency, and my degree is in music, which is its own language, and so music became sort of very integral in my understanding of this because it was a language that had no words, but that somehow, because I grew up in an environment where I was constantly having to identify words in context, identify words I didn't know in context I did know, understanding music was very second nature to me because it was all about sort of finding the nuance in the sound, even without understanding what the intent of that sound might be. Yeah. I just want to talk a little bit about multilingualism because I think that the Singaporean understanding of multilingualism is quite unique. So the Republic of Singapore Independence Act of 1965 decreed that Malay, Mandarin, Tamil, and English would be the four official languages of Singapore. This means that Mandarin, Malay, and Tamil are officially designated as the mother tongues of the Chinese, Malay, and Indian communities, respectively. Now, this is itself a very problematic sort of posture because especially, and I speak especially with regards to the Indian community, because India currently recognizes 26 official languages and a grand total of about 1,022 different dialects. And it's the vastness of India is quite incredible. And I think in Singapore we are quite used to a very sort of particular way of thinking about the Indian community. But it's only when you go to India that you kind of see the real variety of it. If you go to northeast India, to 6 states called the sister states, one of those states, Nagaland, most Nagas are ethnic Chinese who are Indians. A lot of this is again because of the ways borders have shifted over time. But if you go to its neighboring states of Assam and Manipur, most people would identify as ethnic Hmong people, Burmese, but they are Indians. They are Indian citizens, and they speak an Indian language, but are ethnically Burmese or of Burmese tribes. So for and another interesting thing which most people don't know is that while Tamil would be the most spoken Indian language in Singapore, Tamilians are actually do not form the majority of the Indian community. Sort of, if you were to trace their ancestry back, the people from Andhra Pradesh who speak Telugu are actually form the largest Indian community ethnically in Singapore. It's just that over time, because Tamil became a kind of standard Indian language, they subsumed Tamil as their language, and most of them of my generation don't speak Telugu anymore. But if you went back to the 1920s, they would actually form the largest Indian subgroup here, and a lot of South Indian culture actually comes from Andhra, because Telugu was always considered to be the most poetic and refined of the South Indian languages. So a lot of music, a lot of South Indian classical music, and then by extension, South Indian film music actually comes from this region as well. So culturally, Andhra is actually the dominant South Indian culture, but because Tamil was designated as the official language, all of it became subsumed under a so-called sort of wider Tamil culture. So again, I've already mentioned this, but for an individual like myself, what this meant was that regardless of what language I may have spoken in early childhood, in my case, it was sort of a dialect. But even if you spoke Malayalam or you spoke Gujarati or Marathi, you were determined. If you were determined to be Indian, only were able to do this one language in school. And in my time, they didn't offer. I mean, not that I don't come from a family that speaks Hindi or Gujarati, but now you can take those as second languages. But at that time, that was not offered. A lot of my friends who were Punjabi and Gujarati had a lot of issues in primary school because on the first day, they would all just be put into the Tamil class. And then the teacher would realize that actually that they're not meant to be here. And so then they would have to get special permission to then switch to Malay. So many of them ended up taking Malay as their second language, but they had to go through an administrative process before they could do so. It was not a choice they could make. So the imposition of this policy was based on two political objectives. First, the English component was seen as sort of facilitating inter-ethnic interaction, to break down communal exclusiveness, and to foster a Singaporean identity that went beyond the ethnicities. But bilingualism was expected to reduce inequalities of occupational achievement between the English educated and the vernacular educated. These were sort of the original tenets of how bilingualism came to be a policy. But I think that over time, it has also sort of eroded our own connections and our own sort of very unique and specific pathways to who we are today, because we've all been subsumed under these very large, very sweeping umbrella groups. So sort of these are the questions I want to sort of leave you guys with, which is sort of what is at stake when multilingualism is regulated against the languages I grew up with, and what is the intimacy with language and identity that we lose when you're told that that I can't speak a language a certain way because that's not the official or correct way of speaking it. And does that mean then that that language that is my mother tongue is not mine? So it becomes something sanctioned that I have a relationship with, that I'm meant to have a relationship with, but that I don't have any intimacy with because it's not connected to my identity and to my family. Yeah. So these are my sort of two questions that I kind of leave to the floor as we sort of move into the next segment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shrida. I think the two questions that you posed at the end is something important for us to all think about as well. Thank you, of course, to all the other esteemed panelists as well for the enlightening presentations and valuable insights on today's theme, language and our worlds. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we'll proceed to the question and answer segment where I first invite all our panelists and moderator to take your seats in front, please. And all to our esteemed attendees, we welcome you to raise any questions that you may have. You may use the Slido Q&A platform using the code 820192, code 820192, by first scanning the QR code on screen in front. Or if you wish to ask any questions personally, you can. There will be a roving microphones as well. And with that, I think I will hand it over to Ms. Shireen to lead us through the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you, Tauhid. Thank you very much for. It's so interesting also just to see the personal context in which we are learning languages, right? And it starts usually from the home. I guess as we're waiting for the questions to come in, I have one of my own to everyone here that's seated in the panel discussion today, and that's mainly. I think something that really stuck with me is when Mrs. Adora, you mentioned about, inform, educate, and entertain. And a lot of that comes from the personal context in which we want to learn languages. And it starts from home, it starts from love, it starts from the relationships that you share with the people from home, or even when you're walking in the supermarket with your friend and you realize that there's a word that you found very familiar to yourself. But a lot of that also focuses on the younger generation, in reclaiming their heritage. So it starts with the people, the younger ones that we see today, and encouraging them to understand where their identities come from and where their personal heritages are. What are some ways or challenges that you've seen in encouraging intergenerational knowledge transfers for language that starts with the older generation instead?
Yes. Um, Maybe I can share based on experience. You're talking about the older generation and the younger generation. I just give you one example. So there was one time when my late mom had a fish bone, like shoved in between, just right under the nail. So we took like a pair of tweezers and then we went. He's laughing. We wanted to extract that fish bone. And at that time, my son is 27 now. So at that time, he was maybe in kindergarten. So we gave him a torchlight. And then I was trying to pull out this piece of bone. And then I told him, Fuad, Sulo, Fuad, Sulo, Sulo. So I mean, shine that thing. And then he was like struggling. And then he was so frustrated. He said, "What is Sulu?" And that was when we realized that they really don't understand. And there was another one. I was eating, and then I said, "Fuad, ambil ikan bawa tudung saji." You know how you put thing and then you cover it? That's called the tudung saji. And then he said, "Okay." And then my mom went to the kitchen and he opened every single door of the cabinet, every single one. And then my mom said, Fuad, what are you trying to look for? He said, Mommy said, ambil ikan bawa tudung saji. And then that was my late grandmother. Anyway, and another story, but my mother is Chindian. So my grandmother, who's Chinese, she said, you cannot teach a child a second language without buying a book with photos. Like you have to have those. You're saying tudung saji and ikan and sulu, and he doesn't understand you. You have to. So what we did was we drove all the way to JB to buy those books. So, I mean, that is my experience through intergenerational more challenges. I can feel how you feel because recently I was at this Indian store and sitting beside two Indian gentlemen and they were talking in Tamil. And I went home and I told Mama, I said, how was it that I understood every single thing they said? And then he said, that was because your grandfather was Indian, right? So you have Indian family members speaking in Tamil. So I totally understand what you go through. But that was my experience, Shireen. I hope it helps.
I think speaking. I mean, a lot of my Chinese friends say that they can't communicate sometimes with their grandparents who only speak dialect because and don't speak Mandarin. So and a lot of it is because like again we at a certain point in our lives, we stop. School becomes sort of like everything, right? So you spend all your time at school, and at school you're only being exposed to a certain kind of language, and you don't speak to your grandparents as much. So then you lose connection to a language that actually you would have been familiar with when you were younger because they were sort of always around. So I think it's always like being able to have those conversations. I also think documentation is a really or like thinking about how you archive them, archive how they speak, archive how their memories and things also is very useful because I think like I mean there's obviously sort of kind of a national sort of historical narrative that is documented, but I think like the memories of like the generations that lived in those times is also not being documented properly. So I think like thinking about how you can preserve sort of the way they speak, the way they remember, and the way they like communicate about things. Like what you were saying about how like how they speak Mandarin is different from sort of a standard like sort of Chinese. Like just documenting these things, I think is really important because then we sort of remember that the confluence of how we sort of deal with language is very different and very unique to Singapore. Yeah.
Kids young age around 6 or 5 year old to speak the dialects. And besides that, we also one of my this master student who did the research, and then we discovered that a lot of parents really take into consideration okay, that's what the problem that our youngsters are facing. They speak English more than the Chinese, and then but the parents think that in order if you can't speak dialect, it's okay, but as long as you speak Chinese, that should be fine. And then we discovered that for the past few years, there's an increase of the parents who try to teach their kids in speaking Mandarin, but they also face problems. It's because when they're coaching the student, the kids, how to do the homework, they can't use Mandarin to coach them with the science and math. And English, okay, not to measure about that one. And they did complain, the parents, okay, from our investigation, the parents actually feedback to MOE. So how, they always throw the question back to the MOE. So how can we be doing this without your help? So the MOE asks, what can we help? And they'll be saying that, can we have more activity that involve the mother tongue? The so-called, actually the mother tongue for the Chinese is also very odd idea. Mother tongue is when you are born, the very first language your mom taught you. But in Singapore, our case is quite different. A lot of our kids, the mother tongue, so-called mother tongue, is not Chinese, but is English. Yeah. So the MOE side, they have come up with something like this mother tongue weeks, and they pay a lot of money to the school. They give a lot of money to the school, they sponsor. And then for these 2 weeks, right, mother tongue teacher, try always to encourage your students or your pupils, they also have it in the secondary school, to speak Mandarin. And I think, sad to say, that's what we can try to do. Yeah, and then in NIU, we taught our students actually how could they actually create activities in a fun and yet very fulfilled way of learning. Yes.
Thank you very much. And I think, and it's a nice kind of segue into just talking about code switching as well, which was one of the strategies that you spoke about earlier in the conversation before we started the presentation. You mentioned code switching and code mixing, and you brought us through what code mixing is. And I guess that kind of switch that we do because we're so bilingual in the way we think and the way we speak is that sometimes it becomes or culminates into a variation of language like Singlish. And this is a nice seg into one of the questions that we got from the floor today, which is talking about whether we should be concerned that we are losing our individual language identity, or should we accept that different languages or permutations of languages that evolve are accepted as natural evolution.
I think I also accept that. The thing is that you can try, but language itself is evolving. That's why I always see it in that way. And even the PRC people who came to Singapore, and eventually a lot of my students said that when they went back to China, they said that the friends said that, how come your Chinese becomes so strange? How come you have such a strange accent? And then because for the Chinese, right? I mean, ni hao ma, and then there's what we call the 语气词 at the back. And the Singapore, we have a lot because it being influenced by the dialects. We have la le ho me. Yeah. So when they went back, right, and my students said that, okay, that they find that they speak very strange. They have a very strange way of speaking. But I say that is something unavoidable. Yeah, and then you have to accept it. But one thing about the code switching is that, okay, I'll just share with you a story that because my cousin now is a lawyer, and then when he was young, my aunt actually said that, okay, she insisted that you must speak Mandarin at home, and then English you can pick up from the school, in the school. And then there was this particular day that they employed this Filipino maid, and then my cousin was telling her in Mandarin, I want water, 我要水, 我要水. But the maid couldn't understand. So all of a sudden, then he said, I want water. Yeah, so it's something that don't. I mean, we as human beings, we actually can adopt. Yeah, then of course switching the concept is like they believe that what we are saying is a series of these what called symbols, and then when I tell you something, I actually encode everything into a sentence. So your duty is to decode it. And so when we speak, we attend to according to the different situation. Then we try to mix everything together. That's called code mix. It can mix a lot of things. Dialect, other languages, term from other languages. Then code switch is that we discover something that this is okay. This was my thesis when I was studying in this NUS. We discovered something like when you meet up with different people, your code switch. Yeah, and then so when it's quite true because when normally I would speak very localized Mandarins in Singapore, I will have a lot of la le ho. But when I go to Beijing, within 6 hours, then my Mandarin will be very much like how they pronounce it. Yeah, 你好吗? Yeah, that's all. I always believe that code switching and code mixing, we can actually maybe we can make use of this one and then to immerse the student, our younger generation, into an environment where they can pick up the language more efficiently. That's what we are hoping. Yeah.
Sorry, can you repeat? Have you just repeated?
So the question was on the whether we should accept the permutation of new languages that come from the languages that we learn as form of natural evolution.
Yeah, I think all languages evolve, and most of the languages we speak today are all languages that evolve from other languages anyway. So it's I think the evolution is, I think, an important part of it, but I think also it's important to know sort of like how how much our identity is shaped by languages from the past, or languages that people spoke from generations before, because I think it helps us then sort of sometimes the thing about like being in Singapore, and especially like I think being sort of like of a minority race in Singapore, is that we feel can feel quite untethered to sort of untethered to who we are, that because I have very little personal connection to India. I have like almost no family who lives there. And when I go there, people immediately know that I'm not from India. So it's I even need a visa to go to India. So it's by the same, so that's not me. Then this, but at the same time, like I'm not of the majority race here also, and that by the majority culture. So therefore, like there's always this sort of dichotomy, and especially in my case, because I'm third culture, like I grew up I spent a lot of time in America, so I like identify with many sort of values that I learned in America, but I'm also not American. So it's always I always feel like I'm floating somewhere in a space that in which sort of like I belong everywhere and belong nowhere, and I feel like thinking about how I speak, or thinking about the way I spoke to my grandparents anchors me in them. It anchors me in their story, and their story is Singapore as well. They were here, they lived here during the war. My grandfather, sorry, I digress. It's a funny story. So, in India, there's a thing called OCI, an Overseas Citizen of India. So anybody who is of Indian origin can apply to be an overseas citizen of India, and it gives you full rights as a citizen of India, except you can't vote and you can't own agricultural land. That's it. Everything else you can do there. You can work there, you can buy an apartment there, everything, with no taxes, nothing. But in order to do that, you have to prove that at least one of your grandparents came from India. I don't have this, my parents do, and it took forever for us to get that, because like my grandparents came here in the 20s and 30s. They they didn't keep their passports, and then and I asked my grandfather, like, oh, like what, like how, like you were an Indian citizen of India, or you were a citizen of British India, and then you came here, and then so what happened? He's like, oh yeah, in 1959 when Singapore got self-governance, your grandmother and we just went to Supreme Court, we took the oath, and then we just threw our Indian passport in the trash lah, because we were no longer going back to India. What? So I was like, okay, I guess like, so for them it was like like there was no question of like what it meant to now feel like I'm part of this country, like this is home now. In fact, the way we found it was my grandfather's ancestral home in Kerala. A distant cousin of the family still lives in that house, and they in somewhere found his like primary school record from Kerala from 1928. So through that, my parents were able to then get like this OCI thing. But then it just goes to show like how like they never saw any issue with sort of becoming a part of Singapore, but because for them that this was sort of they built this, they were part of building this. I think so for us it's now thinking about, okay, how do we sort of continue that, how do we build new things for ourselves, but by maintaining these connections with the stories that they brought here when they came here, if that makes sense, I guess.
I totally agree, and I think it's a very useful reminder that some of the earlier ways of community making has always been through defining common language. And I think that's something that I want to get to as well. But I have a question here for Mrs. Adora. There is a question that asks, what are some of the challenges that Malay language speakers, especially the young and students, face in Singapore today?
I think this question links with the previous one. As a broadcaster, I'm very worried about it because who is going to replace us? It's really very, very difficult. When we have contests, like, so you want to be the next DJ or you want to be the next presenter or you want to whatever, I'm talking about Malay language, you hardly have anyone. I mean, you do have them, but you don't get quality because all your Malay kids are applying for maybe like the 987 competition, right? I'm very, very concerned about it. Very, very concerned because I'm part of the panel where we interview candidates, and I think you guys agree with me. All Malay kids have an accent. Either they have an English accent or they have a Chinese accent. That's very interesting. My son sounds like a Chinese, like when he speaks Malay, because there was one time my friend said, "Yeah, anak Cina siapa ni cakap?" But it's actually my kid. So it's because of mixing, right? They mix together and then this code mixing thing. So so that's the main challenge, I think, to find the next radio, TV, podcast presenters who can speak live. You can script them, especially when you watch like Cepat Tepat, whatever. It can be scripted. The teachers teach them and they speak okay. But you ask them to speak live, it's whoa, that's another thing. So I think I mean, of course, NIE, MOE, the teachers, they're really helping and they do tell us if they have students who have potential and we will pay attention to that. But I think we are having a problem here to find replacement.
Are there any reflections also for, in terms of the languages that you speak, and you find similar challenges as Mrs. Adora has already mentioned?
I think my students are currently also facing the same problem because when I forced them actually to, before they submit the assignment, there was a project. I say I need to scan through. And then what I need to scan through, the basic first one will be the language. And there was this particular student, I say, I know that you're writing Chinese, but the problem is that I don't understand, don't know what you're writing about.
Direct translation.
I'm not sure because not no relationship between the sentences and sentences. I said you cannot anyhow speak like what you like or when you speak to me, and then I mean the coherent, the flow must be there, of which I don't understand. And then even one student told me that, oh, I think I'm facing the same problem also. I said then because I'm teaching, they'll become a future teacher. So I said I'm very worried. But we're still trying to do whatever we can in order to help them. And I told them, I said, I believe that you will improve. But you need to try harder. I think that's all I can say.
Thank you very much. And I think this is so apt because both of you also, and I'm sure Shrida, in your interactions or programs that you've produced as well, that this is the challenge that you face with the younger generation. And there are two questions here that I think I can link. One question here is what you personally think gives rise to the disinterest of learning mother tongue languages, and also if that has any link into how we can reframe the way we think about English language as a way for us to enter the mainstream. And that's the reason why, in some cases, that is given the priority for ourselves in terms of personal career development.
It's actually quite a good question. I think I think the thing about English also is that I think we also have to accept the English sort of now functions on two levels. There's one, of course, English as sort of the kind of business language of Singapore, but then also culturally that sort of American British culture has always sort of dominated Singapore and still continues to. So even though we speak we speak English as a formal business activity language, but that also we are exposed to English culturally as sort of the primary sort of primary language of any form of culture that we consume is mostly that, right? So I think one of the switches very much is sort of in sort of recognizing sort of the influence that mother tongue that you speaking mother tongue or another language has from a cultural perspective rather than from a learning perspective. I think like there is a and I think a lot of it and I speak particularly for like Tamil in particular is that there's a lot of language gatekeeping that happens in a particular generation that like and again a lot of it also connected to like sort of dialect is that oh there's only this is the way you speak this language and any other way is wrong, right? And then the moment you do that people are automatically then be like well but in English I can express myself in any way possible and nobody sort of gatekeeps the way I speak it, right? So they automatically will drift towards English. And a lot of it comes from sort of the protectionism around wanting to preserve the language and stuff like that. So I think that the more we can accept sort of the kind of the vernacularism of the mother tongues in daily spoken life and it not having to be this very formal that only the formal way of speaking it is sort of acceptable. I think it will actually loosen up the reins for people to want to speak it, you know, every day rather than it being like oh I feel scared because I don't speak it like that so then I don't so then I just say I just speak English only lah, you know. Yeah.
Any more reflections from speakers on that question before we move on?
Okay, for the Chinese, okay, so-called with the Mandarin that we're speaking today, is we call there's another name for it, it's called vernacular Chinese, and it's very similar to, it's greatly influenced by the English language, but yeah, very interesting, huh? Yeah, but the thing is that nowadays we discover that because okay, my part-time hobby is to read the headlines of the Chinese newspaper. And then I discovered something that is getting more and more like English language. So for my students, we have courses like to teach them actually to differentiate or distinguish the differences between these two languages. Even though I would say that at the end of the day, who knows? The Chinese will be, and the sentences construction will be exactly like English language. We do not know. But at the current moment, I mean, my student has to understand what are the differences, and then when they go to school, or like what one of my master students is taught to be doing, we are trying to pick up all these sentences, lexical, how they use the lexical items, this sentence construction, and how they are being influenced from the English language. Then we categorize them into few category. And I believe that after we have completed this one, then we'll go to the school and inform the teacher, you, the teacher who is teaching the language, Chinese language, you must know all this. If not, you can't be telling, because I heard from my student who is now currently a teacher say that to some extent they do not know when they are marking this sentence construction, the 造句, right? Then they say, I really cannot differentiate. Why is it wrong? But I can just feel that it's not correct. That's the part, you see. Yeah.
Thank you. I think it's so interesting as well. And it goes back to this point of code mixing and code switching as a way, one of the ways forward so that we can continue developing not just interest but also our caliber in speaking languages other than English. I will wrap up this Q&A session with one last question. To all three of you, what are some of the ways that we can encourage more people to accept and embrace code switching and also code mixing in a way? And how does that code switching attitude differ among different generations?
I think code switching and code mixing, for me at least, would be in casual situations, right? Definitely not for national broadcast channels. That has to be pure language, right? But if you ever had the chance to work with us, to enter a radio or a television studio, you will notice that everybody in there, everybody speaks English. They speak English. The traffic, the traffic news, the weather, everything is in English. And then they turn on the mic and they do direct translation. They just say whatever language it is, and then they turn off their mic and they continue speaking in English. Like my partner and I, we will always speak in English. We never speak in Malay in the studio, but when we go on air, we speak pure Malay. But I think code switching and code mixing allow kids like my kid to pick up Malay, because for the longest time Muhammad and I struggle with getting our son to speak Malay, and to after that we panic. We taught Malay to our second one. They're almost 10 years apart, and then she grew up not knowing how to speak English, and she's laughing, my friend's laughing, because my friend asked my daughter, Iman, do you want to play the bicycle? And she was like, do you want to play the bicycle? And she just smiled. And then the brother said, Iman, nak main bicycle? Nah! Because and then people asked us, what's wrong with you? Both your kids are extreme. One doesn't know how to speak Malay and one doesn't know how to speak English. But now they have met in the middle. But my son, or our son, picked up Malay during NS. Really, during NS, he started picking up Malay, some not so good Malay words, but mostly good Malay words, and then songs. And then they had Malay songs that Chinese friends, they sang together. So I find code mixing and code switching worked well for my family because of national service, and for our daughter because we sent her to like this private school, and she was forced, and there was no Malay students there. She was forced to pick up English and Mandarin, so that helped for us. And but that is our experience.
I think it's actually like from childhood. It's a very childhood thing. I think there's a very critical language age between sort of 3 and 6, and I think like if you sort of is as parents, if you code switch quite deliberately at that age, the kids will automatically develop a year in which they are able to understand two languages simultaneously all the time. And then once that's sort of in the year, right? Once sort of like the tones of because languages the tones of languages are so different from each other. Once that the tonal registers, they can sort of like be able to identify differences in that and connect that to words. It means that once they get to sort of a sort of more formal education age, they just sort of it just integrates into their sort of cognitive sort of the language part of their cognitive like behavior very quickly. So I feel like actually doing it from a very young age that's actually very critical, and not sticking to one language only. And it's why like my friend again, like my friend whom I said who's half Iranian and half Greek, it's because like from that in that ages he spoke to the Iranian part of his family in Farsi and he spoke to the Greek part of the family in Greek. They only spoke to him in Greek. This one only spoke to him in Farsi. So his brain is just wired to like constantly go back and forth, to constantly switch, and to constantly like to think in Persian in one context and think in Greek in another context, right? So because actually like even when I speak like French or Italian, I'm still thinking in English and then translating it into a spoken language. But but with Tamil and English, like I'm able to in my brain, like my thoughts switch between the two depending on what I want to express or say. But when I'm speaking any of the other languages that I've learned, because I learned them formally, like I still think in English and have to translate it into that language before I can actually say it out loud. Yeah.
And then I can just speak from the social linguistic perspective. This is unavoidable. And then because I'm doing this research of the language in Singapore, and this is where the uniqueness. This is so unique, But not for the future school teachers. My advice is that you must understand what are the differences, what is correct and what is wrong, and then how this one derive from where actually, and for example, like okay, actually I believe that our government has done something. Like if you are interested in to know, just now like what I said, that loan shark, why is it called 大耳龙 in the Chinese? If you are interested, you can go to the Oral History Museum, right? Yeah. That's it's because last time that people who is loan shark, but they won't be telling you that I am the loan shark. So how they do it? They put the coin in the ear. Yeah, so we walk around. So you want to borrow money, you see, hey, that guy got a coin in the ear. Just approach him. Yeah, and then that's why we call 大耳龙. And then now because some newspaper they put it 大耳龙, long which means that it's deaf. So I said, hey, it's wrong, you know, it's not deaf, no. It just want to indicate that actually you got something in the ear. Yeah. So all these things you can actually find from the Oral History Museum. Yeah, it's very interesting. So that's what our government trying to preserve some of the all these things. Yeah, I find that very interesting also. Yeah, if got opportunity, I can share more actually.
We know where to find you after this. And I think with that, we'll end the session today. And we thank everyone again, especially the panelists, for just illuminating presentations, and everyone here for taking your time on your Saturday morning to be with us. I'll pass the mic over to Tauhid. Close the session.
Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for our exceptional panel today. Once again, thank you, Madam Rahayu, Ms. Shireen Marican, and our three guest speakers. All right. Now, as we draw the curtains on the fourth Sembang Ilmu Plus lecture, allow me to make some very short administrative announcement. I understand it's lunch time. I see some hungry and angry faces. Just bear with me for a while. For your information, details about our programs are available online on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and the MHF website. Video recordings for today's session will also be accessible on our YouTube channel. For those keen to access a wide range of these courses, you may access our papers on our website as well. Please stay connected with us on our social media to stay updated on the latest news on MHF. You may also subscribe to our newsletter and join MHF's mailing list. Before officially concluding this Sembang Ilmu Plus session, I invite everyone here to scan the QR code in front and complete the feedback form. Your valuable feedback is greatly welcomed and appreciated. Ladies and gentlemen, in today's session, we have talked greatly about the power of language to shape our lives. And another thing that shapes our lives, and in fact, change our life, is good food, which is what we have prepared for everyone today outside. Please, as you take your leave later, do help yourself to some refreshments that we have prepared just outside this room. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, our deepest appreciation to everyone for making time to be with us on this Saturday morning. Till we meet again in the next session, stay tuned for updates on all our social media platforms. And on behalf of MHF, I sincerely apologize for any shortcomings. Thank you very much. Have a pleasant Saturday ahead. Thank you.